The night Miss Marple knew she was being followed. Dear friends, welcome once again to another cosy mystery on Warm Chapters. I'm Thomas, and it is always a pleasure to spend this time with you. Do tell us where you are listening from, and what sort of weather is visiting your corner of the world today. And if you enjoy these gentle mysteries, do subscribe. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let us begin. Chapter 1. A name printed in the Gazette. St. Mary Mead was, in all the ways that most truly mattered, a village devoted to the proper management of its past. It liked its histories settled, labelled, and put away with the same neat finality one gave to a carefully preserved jar upon a pantry shelf. Visible, certainly, but not to be opened without very good reason. There was comfort in that arrangement. Villages, after all, may thrive upon continuity, and St. Mary Mead had always possessed a marked preference for continuity over disturbance. By the latter part of October, the elms along Church Lane had begun to release their leaves one by one in slow, graceful spirals, so that the air itself seemed to take part in some quiet, seasonal ritual. The mornings had grown still in that particularly English fashion, which belongs to the countryside just before winter asserts itself, when the earth appears to pause, not in idleness, but in expectation. There was dampness in the hedgerows, smoke beginning to hang lower in the evenings, and the peculiar hush that comes when a year begins, however reluctantly, to close itself up. Miss Jane Marple had lived in St. Mary Mead for the greater part of her life, and knew it as intimately as some men know the fields they have worked since boyhood. Not merely the roads and names and visible arrangements of things, but the temper of the place, its habits of concealment, its recurring weaknesses, and the ways in which trouble gathered first in corners before moving outward into the light. She was a slight elderly lady, white-haired and delicate-looking, with a manner so mild and unassuming that strangers were frequently misled into thinking her of no particular significance. Those who had lived long in St. Mary Mead had long since surrendered that mistaken comfort. Her blue eyes, clear and observant behind their spectacles, were among the least deceivable features in the village. Her knitting accompanied her through many of the quieter passages of the day, lending her hands the appearance of gentle occupation, while her thoughts moved with a precision and patience all their own. She lived in a trim little house on the edge of the village, where the garden, now entering its more austere season, remained her chief pride and steady consolation. Though late autumn had stripped it of brilliance, it had not diminished its order. The rose beds had been properly mulched, the herbaceous borders cut back with exactness, and the yew hedge at the far end stood clipped into a dark, velvety smoothness that spoke not only of labour, but of long familiarity. On fine afternoons, Miss Marple might often be found seated by the drawing-room window, observing the lane with an expression of mild, almost idle interest. It was an expression that concealed, as such expressions so often do, considerable degree of attention. She had long ago discovered that if one wished to know what people were about, it was seldom necessary to pursue them. One had merely to remain still long enough and watch. It was in the second week of October that the notice appeared in the County Gazette, that indispensable publication which circulated faithfully through every respectable household in St. Mary Mead, and supplied material for discussion at the post office, the haberdashers, and the Wednesday meetings of the ladies' parochial circle with admirable regularity. The notice itself was small, almost modest to the point of self-effacement, and set out in the restrained language custom reserved for such announcements. It recorded the death of Mr. Raymond Avery, formerly of St. Mary Mead and lately of Cheltenham, at the age of 81, or after a brief illness borne with patience. There followed the expected details of a memorial service to be held in Cheltenham, and the brief, almost sterile addition that he was survived by no immediate family. Miss Marple read the notice once, then she read it again. That was her way with anything which touched, however lightly, upon the older layers of village life. Raymond Avery. The name rested in her mind with an odd distinctness. She had known him after a fashion, or rather she had known of him, which in a village of St. Mary Mead's size came to very nearly the same thing. He had gone away some 35 years earlier, quietly, without fuss, and with that air of conclusion that encourages people not to ask questions. He had not returned. His name had surfaced only occasionally since then, and always in the tone people reserve for matters supposedly finished: a drawer closed, a file put away, an occurrence no longer requiring active thought. The following morning, at the post office, where Miss Marple had gone to collect a parcel of wool from a supplier in Cheltenham, she found that the notice had already performed its social function. 81, said Mrs. Baines, the postmistress, who was a stout woman of brisk efficiency and lively opinions, as she sorted the morning letters with practised fingers. Well, that's not such a bad age, is it? He went away quite young, if I remember rightly. Before my time, really, though my mother used to speak of him. He was considered a pleasant young man, said Miss Marple, accepting the parcel and tucking it beneath her arm. Hard-working. I believe he held some sort of post connected with the county surveyor's office. Did he indeed? I never knew much about him. Kept to himself toward the end, I've heard. Mrs. Baines held an envelope up briefly to the light, frowned at it with suspicion, and dropped it into a tray. There was something, though, wasn't there? Some business, or was it personal? I can never quite remember. Miss Marple smiled a small, agreeable smile that committed her to nothing whatever. I expect there was, she said pleasantly. There had in fact been rather more than Mrs. Baines's vague uncertainty suggested. But Miss Marple was not in the habit of supplying information simply because somebody else had failed to keep hold of it. Information she had always felt ought to be given for a reason, and one ought first to know what that reason was. The visitor arrived on a Tuesday, 9 days after the notice appeared in the Gazette. He presented himself first at the Blue Boar, which served as the village's sole respectable lodging-house, and engaged a room for an indefinite stay. This small circumstance was naturally noted by Mr. Hedges, the landlord, relayed to Mrs. Hedges before luncheon, passed on in confidence to the greengrocer's wife, and from there distributed by the usual invisible but remarkably efficient village channels, so that by the following afternoon it had become common knowledge that a gentleman from Cheltenham had arrived in St. Mary Mead, and did not appear to be in any immediate hurry to depart. His name was Julian Avery. He was a man of about 45, perhaps a year or two older, lean in build and measured in all his movements. His hair, light brown and touched at the temples with silver, gave him an air at once thoughtful and faintly tired. His face was not striking precisely, but it had that rare quality of seeming to register concern and self-command at the same time. He dressed well, though discreetly, and he spoke with a restrained clarity that suggested a person accustomed not merely to speaking carefully, but to withholding more than he said. At the Blue Boar he described himself as a distant relation of the late Mr. Raymond Avery, come to settle certain estate matters and while in the district to learn something of Raymond's early years in the village. It was a sufficiently natural explanation. Indeed, it was almost too natural, being exactly the sort of explanation that satisfies most listeners because it appears to leave nothing untidy behind it. Miss Marple met Mr. Julian Avery for the first time on Thursday morning near the village green, where she had paused to observe with inward disapproval the deplorable state of her municipal flower bed, which had not, she felt, received proper attention since Easter. He approached with perfect courtesy, lifting his hat in the manner of a man who had been correctly taught such things in youth, and had not abandoned them in middle age. "I am very glad to make your acquaintance, Miss Marple," he said. "I'm told you have known St. Mary Mead a very long time." "A very long time indeed," said Miss Marple. "You must remember a great many things," he said, "about the village as it once was. The people, I mean." "A village remembers far more than it admits to remembering," said Miss Marple, "and rather longer too. Often longer than is comfortable." He smiled at that, but the smile was brief and not wholly easy. It carried, she thought, something suspended within it, neither relief nor unease exactly, but the tension of a man nearing a place he has been seeking for some time and is not altogether sure he wishes to find. He asked her several questions then, lightly phrased, perfectly suitable to casual conversation. Had Raymond Avery been well thought of in his younger days? Had he been sociable? Had he played a part in village activities? Would one have called him cheerful by temperament? Miss Marple answered what she chose to answer, but far more important than what he did ask was what he carefully omitted. He did not mention Mrs. Eleanor Price. That omission was, to Miss Marple's mind, considerably more instructive than any direct question would have been. Mrs. Eleanor Price was among the most respected women in the village, a widow of 68 who had given much of her adult life to parish work of every useful and unglamorous kind. She served on committees, managed charitable appeals, arranged flowers for church festivals with a seriousness approaching liturgical devotion, and visited the sick and elderly with a steadfastness on which half the parish relied more than it knew. She was a tall, spare woman, upright in carriage and exact in manner. Her grey hair was always neatly arranged, her clothes always suitable, her speech always correct. She was not exactly affectionate, but she was immensely dependable, and villages lean hardest, though often least gratefully, upon such women. Miss Marple had called upon her the previous evening under the entirely legitimate pretext of returning a book of pressed flower illustrations borrowed some months before. The call had proved useful. Mrs. Price had received her with perfect civility, offered tea, inquired after the state of the garden, and made no reference whatever to the new arrival at the Blue Boar. Miss Marple, after a suitable interval and midway through a second cup, mentioned him in passing. The effect had been very slight, so slight indeed that a less observant person might have called it no effect at all. Mrs. Price's face did not alter, her hand did not falter on the teacup, her voice, when she answered, remained as composed as ever. And yet, for perhaps 3 seconds, no more than that, there was in her stillness something of an entirely different order from ordinary self-command. It was the difference, Miss Marple thought, between a pond that lies naturally undisturbed and one whose surface is being held still by force. "Avery," Mrs. Price had said. "I see. A relation of Raymond's?" "So he says," Miss Marple had replied mildly, keeping her gaze on her knitting. "How interesting," said Mrs. Price. Then she changed the subject to the crumbling state of the churchyard wall. Miss Marple did not press it. She finished her tea, admired a vase of rather splendid late chrysanthemums on the mantel, and took her leave in the most amiable manner possible. As she walked home along Church Lane in the blue hush of early evening, and she turned these small observations over in her mind with the methodical care she always brought to such matters, Julian Avery's questions were cautious, his manner was quiet, his stated reason for coming to the village was perfectly straightforward, yet it was precisely this careful moderation that gave her pause. In Miss Marple's experience, people who made a point of seeming unimportant often did so for reasons of the utmost significance, and people who confined themselves to harmless questions were very often in search of answers too dangerous to be asked for openly. The village, she thought, did not yet understand what had begun to move beneath its surface. She herself was beginning to suspect it. At her own gate she paused a moment before going in. The garden lay still around her, dim and orderly in the fading light. The yew hedge at the far end had become a darker mass against the pale evening sky. Somewhere behind her in the lane, a thrush gave a single late note and fell silent. Miss Marple went indoors, set the kettle on, and resumed her place by the lamp with her knitting. There was, she reflected, a very great deal still to be understood. Chapter 2. Dusk beside the Allotments. The Allotments lay at the eastern edge of St. Mary Mead, beyond the church wall and the narrow path which the older inhabitants still persisted in calling Glee Lane, though no official map had acknowledged the name for the better part of 3 decades. They occupied a modest rectangle of ground divided, in accordance with the excellent democratic principles governing such institutions, into a series of plots of theoretically equal promise and practically very unequal result. At one end, old Mr. Featherington maintained his vegetables with something like military discipline. His rows of Brussels sprouts stood in crisp and orderly formation, and his soil possessed that dark-turned exactness which suggested daily inspection and little tolerance for laxity. At the opposite end, the Griggs family's plot had for years resembled a cheerful botanical compromise, a benevolent confusion of stalks, leaves, twine, and accident, from which runner beans and marrows of surprising respectability nevertheless emerged each season with a kind of untidy triumph. Between these extremes, the remaining plots offered a faithful portrait of their keepers' respective temperaments. By late October, the allotments had acquired the look of a stage after the principal performances had concluded. The glory of summer had been mostly gathered and carried off in baskets. What remained were the structural hints of past abundance: canes, frames, turned earth, the last cabbages and kale standing against the weather with modest stubbornness, and the faint vegetal smell of cooling soil. At 4:30 in the afternoon, though the hour was not yet late by the clock, the sun had already begun its early autumn retreat, and the light spread across the plots in a mellow amber wash that was warm only on the surface. Beneath it lay the first true suggestion of winter. Miss Marple had not gone out that Thursday with any intention of visiting the allotments. Her original purpose had been to call upon Mrs. Arthur Bantry at Meadowcroft, a large and comfortable house on the far side of the village green, somewhat oversized for a widow of independent but not extravagant means, but inhabited by its owner with the cheerful and unapologetic pragmatism of a woman who liked what she had and saw no reason in the world to exchange it for less. Dolly Bantry had been Miss Marple's friend for many years. She was a woman of warmth, candour, and energetic good sense, broad of figure, lively of speech, and blessed with a laugh that travelled satisfyingly through a house. She possessed that invaluable quality, rare enough in any setting, rare still in village society, of being genuinely interested in other people. This gift led her at times to observations of quite dazzling accuracy, and at others to conclusions of such magnificent error that she accepted correction with the same good humour that had produced the mistake. They had taken tea in the sitting-room beside a fire of apple logs. The conversation had moved as old conversations do, easily, without plan, passing from the gardens to parish matters, from the weather to winter, and at last, as naturally as a stream finding the lower ground, to the subject of Mr. Julian Avery. "I saw him this morning," said Dolly, pouring a second cup with the liberality she brought to most human arrangements. "Coming out of the Blue Boar. He held the door for Mrs. Croft in a way I particularly noticed." Miss Marple looked up. "Indeed?" "Yes, not in that exaggerated manner some men have as though they wish to be observed being courteous. It was very well done." "Entirely natural," Dolly paused. "I liked him for it." "He is careful," said Miss Marple. "Careful," repeated Dolly, considering. "Yes, that is exactly the word. As though he has formed a very clear idea of the impression he wishes to produce, and is taking pains not to overdo it." She looked at Miss Marple with the frankness of old friendship. "What is he after, Jane?" "I am not yet entirely certain," said Miss Marple, which was true only in the narrowest possible sense. She had in fact formed a view. What remained uncertain were the contours and concealed passages of it. "He asks after Raymond Avery," she continued. "He's interested in the village as Raymond knew it, but his interest has a distinct shape. One notices not only the roads down which he walks, but those he avoids." Dolly stirred her tea slowly. "Meaning?" "Meaning that there are certain subjects he does not approach at all, and when a person avoids a subject entirely, it is often because he already knows enough about it to be afraid of what further knowledge may confirm." Dolly was quiet for a moment, watching the fire shift and settle. "Raymond Avery," she said at last, with that slow, tentative air of someone opening a drawer whose contents may or may not be welcome. "I only remember him very vaguely. He was before my real time in the village, but there was a connection with Eleanor Price, wasn't there? Or perhaps not Eleanor herself. A sister. Margaret." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "Margaret." There was a short silence then, but not an empty one. "I never heard the full story," said Dolly. "No," said Miss Marple, "you would not have done. It was one of those matters that were managed quietly." She said no more, and Dolly, who knew perfectly well when Miss Marple had supplied the outline of a matter but not its heart, did not press her. Instead, they turned to the chrysanthemum show, which had been moderately successful despite the weather, and to the new curate who was earnest, well-meaning, and had now twice contrived to upset the arrangement beside the font during Sunday service, which all agreed was unfortunate but somehow exactly the sort of thing that happens to curates. At 4:00 Miss Marple rose to go. She declined Dolly's suggestion of the car on the entirely reasonable grounds that the walk would do her good, which it would, and that she preferred returning through the old part of the village, which she did. She passed the church, and followed the wall that bordered the churchyard, and turned into the lane beside the allotments. The pavement there was uneven and familiar, the sort of ground one walked more by memory than attention. The evening was closing in with that restrained, almost apologetic quality peculiar to October. Not dramatic, not sudden, but as though daylight itself had grown tired and was withdrawing by degrees from further obligation. She had been walking perhaps 4 minutes when she became aware of footsteps behind her. They were not hurried. That was the first thing she noticed. A person in haste betrays haste at once, however he may attempt to moderate it. It enters the rhythm of the step, the pressure of the heel, the slight carelessness of momentum. These steps were measured, not slow exactly, deliberate. They kept a particular distance with the peculiar consistency of someone who has chosen that distance and means to preserve it. Miss Marple did not turn her head. She had learned a very long time ago that one of the quickest ways to cause a thing to vanish is to show too soon that one has perceived it. Instead, she continued at the same steady pace, passing the first allotment gate, which, as usual, stood unlatched. Old Mr. Featherington having long ago ceased to believe in the necessity of such precautions, passing the break in the wall where an optimistic climbing rose had exceeded all hopes, and now spilled in a thorny tangle of nearly leafless abundance, passing the bend where the lane curved slightly and the last slant of evening light flashed briefly against the windows of the cottages opposite. Then she stopped. She did so naturally, as though some ordinary detail ahead had attracted her notice. There are many harmless reasons for pausing in a village lane, and Miss Marple supplied one without visible effort. She turned then with the composed leisure of a woman who had no intention whatever of appearing startled before the facts justified it. Mr. Julian Avery stood some 30 feet behind her. He stopped too. For a brief moment they looked at one another in the thinning light with a degree of mutual candour that struck Miss Marple as almost a relief. It was the look of two people who had been advancing toward a conversation by an unnecessarily circuitous route, and had, at last, arrived. "Miss Marple," he said. He came toward her with his hat already in his hand, just as he had done before on the village green. But there was something altered in his expression now. The careful reserve she had first observed in him remained, but beneath it lay something less guarded, a direct appeal, almost, or the weariness of a man who has found that caution can only carry him so far. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I am aware this must have looked peculiar." "It looked," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "like a person who wished to speak to me and was uncertain how best to begin." Something in him eased at once. Not entirely, but enough to be seen. It was like watching the first loosening of a knot pulled too tight. "You're not alarmed?" "No," said Miss Marple, "though I ought perhaps to mention that I'm not generally unaware of my surroundings." She regarded him with that clear, mild gaze which had undone stronger people than Mr. Julian Avery. "You wish to ask me something connected with Raymond Avery's years in St. Mary Mead," she said. "You have been asking a number of people a number of perfectly courteous questions, but there is something more particular beneath them which you have not yet asked anyone directly." He was silent for a moment. The lane had gone very still. Somewhere beyond the allotment wall a blackbird, with all the solemn insistence blackbirds bring to evening matters, was delivering its last opinions of the day. "You knew the village then," he said at last. "Better than most people still here. You would have known Raymond Avery, and the people connected with him." He hesitated, then went on. "I hoped you might remember things that were never openly discussed." "I remember a great deal," said Miss Marple. She had said those words to him before, but this time she said them differently, and the difference was not lost on him. There was less social softness in them now and more weight. "Sometimes," she added, "rather more than is convenient." He met her eyes with the steadiness that had about it now not caution but resolve. "I am not looking for convenience," he said quietly. "I am looking for the truth of something that happened a very long time ago. I believe you may either know it or know where it is to be found." The last of the day's light was draining from the lane. Farther on, cottage windows had begun to glow one by one with the warm domestic brightness of early evening. There was about that ordinary sight something curiously reassuring, and yet it threw the seriousness of the moment into sharper outline. Miss Marple considered him. Then she said, and with the settled decisiveness of a person who has completed one stage of judgment, and is prepared to proceed to the next, "In that case, Mr. Avery, I think you'd better come to tea." She turned and resumed her walk. After the briefest hesitation, Julian Avery fell into step beside her, not behind her now, nor at that careful observational distance he had maintained before, but beside her, as one companion walks with another. The blackbird concluded its remarks and flew off into the hedge. The lane settled again into evening stillness, and Miss Marple, her hands folded over her bag, felt her mind already moving inward through old rooms of memory, with the composed purpose of a person entering a darkened house and lighting lamps one by one. There was a great deal, she thought, that Julian Avery did not yet know, and now, at last, there was the beginning of a reason to tell him. Chapter 3. The Caller from Cheltenham. Miss Marple's sitting-room possessed, in the early evening, that particular quality which belongs only to rooms that have been lived in long and lived in thoughtfully. The lamp upon the side table cast its circle of warm and civilized light over the hearthrug, and the low table set with cups, while beyond the windows the October darkness had settled with the complete authority known only in the countryside where no street lamps interfere with the arrangements of night. Jenny, Miss Marple's capable young housekeeper, had made up the fire before leaving for the evening, and it had now arrived at that excellent stage when the coals had ceased to be ambitious and become dependable, glowing steadily, giving off the kind of warmth one can trust. Mr. As Julian Avery sat where Miss Marple had placed him, not in the armchair nearest the fire, which she reserved for guests of long standing and proven comfort, but in the upright chair beside the bookcase, which was perfectly agreeable without encouraging too much ease. Miss Marple had always thought that truth was more readily spoken from a chair that did not invite one to sink into it. She poured the tea with the unhurried certainty of long practice, offered seed cake from the plate Jenny had left ready on the sideboard, and settled herself opposite him with her own cup and her knitting. She took up the knitting not from nerves, for she was never a nervous woman, but from the same instinct, perhaps, that leads a conductor to lift a baton before the music begins. It occupied her hands, and gave the other person's eyes somewhere to rest besides her face, an arrangement which frequently made speech come more naturally. Mr. Avery accepted both tea and cake, and for a little while said nothing. He glanced about the room with a quiet, orderly attention, and Miss Marple, watching him while appearing not to do so, thought that he was a man accustomed to taking stock of his surroundings quickly and without visible effort. It was not precisely suspicion, merely caution, become habitual. "You're wondering," he said at last, "how much I know already, and how much I'm hoping you will provide." "I am wondering," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "rather more what it was that brought you to St. Mary Mead in particular, and why you began where you did, with the older residents, the parish records, and the sort of broad inquiries that allow one to construct a picture without attaching oneself too early to any one detail." Her needles moved quietly. "You do not strike me," she added, "as a man who begins anywhere by accident." He set down his cup with a neat and careful movement. "No," he said, "I am not." For a few moments longer he remained silent, and Miss Marple did not interrupt him. Silence, properly respected, had always seemed to her one of the most useful conditions in which conversation could unfold. People filled it, almost invariably, with the thing most pressing upon their minds. "Raymond Avery," he began at last, "was a man I knew only toward the end of his life. 3 years, perhaps, not longer." He paused. By then he was no longer well. His memory had become unreliable in the ordinary way one associates with age. Recent matters slipped from him, but there were things, older things, which remained with a curious clarity, particularly in the last year. He looked into the fire not absently, but as if arranging his thoughts against its steadiness. "He spoke of St. Mary Mead," he said, "of a summer here, and of a friendship that had not ended as he had hoped." "A friendship," said Miss Marple. "He used that word," said Mr. Avery, "though I think he meant more by it." Outside, a light wind had risen and was making a tentative inquiry at the window panes. The exploratory touch of autumn, not yet the determined force of winter, but a testing of the edges of things. "He spoke of a young woman," Mr. Avery continued. "He did not always name her, but when he did, the name was Margaret." Miss Marple's needles did not pause. See, her face remained composed and attentive, though inwardly she had the sense of drawing something in carefully, as one draws a net through quiet water so as not to disturb what lies beneath. "Margaret Price," she said, not asking but stating it. He looked at her directly. "So you know the name?" "I have known it for a very long time." She set down one needle for a moment and adjusted the wool. "Margaret Price was the younger sister of Mrs. Eleanor Price," she said. "You will, by now, have met Mrs. Price, or at least observed her. She's one of our oldest and most established residents. Margaret was a different sort of woman altogether, quieter, softer in manner. She cared for music and for gardens. She left St. Mary Mead in the autumn of 1932, and she never returned." "Never returned," he repeated. "That," said Miss Marple, "is how it has always been put, and once a village has found its preferred phrasing for an uncomfortable matter, it tends to keep it. The accepted explanation at the time was that Margaret had gone away for her health, to stay with relatives in a quieter situation. In those days, such arrangements were not uncommon." "No," he said, "they were not." There was a weight in the room now, but not an oppressive one, rather the weight of something long present and seldom acknowledged finally beginning to take shape between two people. Miss Marple reached for her teacup. The fire gave a little sigh and shifted in the grate. "Raymond Avery came to the village in the spring of 1931, she said. "As I mentioned before, he held a position connected with the county surveyor's office. Roads, drainage, boundary issues, the sort of work that brings a young man into frequent contact with landowners, parish committees, and all the innumerable small machinery of village life, without necessarily making him one of it. He would have been 24 or 25. She considered a moment. He was well liked. A good-tempered young man, warm-hearted, industrious, and without any trace of vanity. People were disposed to think well of him. And Margaret? She was 22. She sometimes played the organ at Sunday service when the regular organist was unwell, which was often enough, as the regular organist suffered from a constitution that was reliable only in its unreliability. Margaret also assisted her sister in parish matters. She was— Miss Marple chose her words carefully. She was a young woman of more spirit than the village at large gave her credit for. People frequently confuse quietness with passivity. Margaret was not passive. She was private. Something altered, very slightly, in Mr. Avery's expression. It was only a flicker, but Miss Marple saw it plainly enough. Recognition, perhaps, or the confirmation of something half suspected and never named. "That summer," she went on, "the weather was particularly wet, and a good many of the allotments and small holdings near the old mill suffered from poor drainage. Raymond, through his work, was able to help with certain assessments and recommendations at no expense to those concerned. It was a kindness, and one which brought him more often than not into the orbit of the Price household. Her knitting resumed its calm movement. He and Margaret became friends, close friends, the sort of friendship a village notices very quickly, and a family notices with that curious mixture of pleasure and apprehension which often accompanies such matters. "And Eleanor Price?" asked Mr. Avery. "How did she regard it?" Miss Marple looked at him before answering. "Eleanor," she said at last, "is a woman of strong loyalties, to her family, to the parish, to her sense of proper conduct. I do not doubt that she loved Margaret sincerely, but love, in certain characters, expresses itself as supervision rather than companionship. She wished to protect her sister." Her needles clicked softly. Whether Margaret wished to be protected in the way Eleanor preferred is another matter, and not one, to my knowledge, that was ever put to her plainly. Mr. Avery said nothing for a while. He was looking into the fire with the expression of a man who has spent a long time seeking information, and is now discovering that knowledge, once given a human shape, is never quite as manageable as one had imagined. To know a thing in outline is one matter. To feel its emotional weight is quite another. At one of his clearer moments, he said at last, Raymond told me he had cared for her very deeply, that he had intended. He stopped, then began again. He believed there had been an understanding between them, and then, quite suddenly, she was gone. He lifted his eyes to Miss Marple. He said that when he asked about her, Eleanor told him Margaret had gone away for health reasons and, for the time being, did not wish to receive letters. He accepted it. He was young and perhaps less persistent than he should have been. But he accepted it. His voice remained level, yet underneath that levelness Miss Marple detected something which had perhaps taken years to settle into composure. He never heard from her again. No, said Miss Marple gently. I do not think he did. The coals settled again. Somewhere beyond the room, on the main road, a motor car passed. A brief mechanical intrusion from a world that, at that moment, seemed entirely separate from the quiet lamp-lit one in which they sat. You said, Mr. Avery resumed after a moment, that Margaret was a woman of spirit. Private, not passive. What do you mean by that exactly? Miss Marple regarded him over the rim of her spectacles. I mean, she said quietly, that she was capable of making choices of her own, and that the account given of her departure, as it was told by Eleanor and accepted by the village, allowed her very little share in her own story. He was still. Then, slowly, he nodded. It was the nod of a man who has been fitting together pieces in solitude for years and has suddenly found one that not only belongs but changes the shape of the whole. I see, he said. Not entirely, said Miss Marple, with the faintest warmth in her tone. Not yet. But I think, Mr. Avery, that you are beginning to. She refilled his cup and he accepted it. Between them the fire continued to burn with the steady simplicity of a well-tended fire, asking nothing and concealing nothing. Outside, the October night deepened over the village. The wind had quieted. The lane lay dark and still, and in the comfortable hush of Miss Marple's sitting room, amidst seed cake, lamplight, and the small domestic sounds of evening, something that had lain buried for 37 years was beginning, with all the delicacy of a bulb pushing upward through cold earth to move toward the light. Chapter 4. A Look Across the Village Green. Sunday in St. Mary Mead proceeded according to principles so old and so thoroughly absorbed into village life that no one living could remember their origin, and no one expected them ever to alter. The bell of St. Cuthbert's began its summons at 11:15, by which time the more dutiful portion of the congregation had already established themselves in their accustomed pews, while the less punctual could be seen crossing the green with a haste they clearly hoped might be mistaken for spiritual enthusiasm. The morning had turned out fine, and though only in the provisional cautious manner that belongs to late October, a pale sun was doing its modest best behind a veil of high cloud, and the air had that clean sharpness which follows an early frost. On the green itself the grass still held traces of silver where the colder edges of the morning had not quite yielded. Miss Marple walked to church at her usual pace, which was not slow so much as deliberate, the pace of a woman who never hurried past things because experience had taught her that things very often rewarded attention. She wore her good grey coat and the hat with the blue ribbon which she reserved for Sundays and certain proper occasions, and she carried her prayer book with the quiet assurance of someone who meant to use it and generally did. She had attended St. Cuthbert's for more years than she cared to count, and its interior, the smell of old stone, candle wax and hymn books long in service, was as familiar to her as her own garden. On a good morning it offered a similar sense of disciplined order. The service was taken by the new curate, Mr. Timothy Fenn, a young man of perhaps 28 with an open, earnest face, and a manner suggesting that he had prepared his sermon with admirable seriousness, and was perhaps just a little too conscious of having done so. Still, he was kind, his theology was sound, and he possessed the immensely practical virtue of finishing within the hour, which could not be said of his predecessor. His unfortunate habit of upsetting the arrangement beside the font, a thing he had now contrived to do on 2 Sundays and would, as it later transpired, manage once more on the following Thursday before someone repositioned it beyond all geometric possibility of disturbance, was regarded by the village with the indulgent patience generally extended to the harmless failings of the well-intentioned. Miss Marple settled into her pew, third row from the front on the left-hand side, which was where she'd always sat, and which the village regarded as hers in that absolute and unspoken way villages reserve for such matters. Mrs. Baines was 2 rows behind on the right. Old Mr. Featherington occupied the end seat of the front pew, with the settled confidence of a man who had sat there so long that the position had become, in his mind, almost hereditary. The Griggs family, with young Tom, his wife Pauline and their 2 children, arranged in descending order of fidgeting, occupied the middle rows. Around them the rest of St. Mary Mead distributed itself according to an invisible but strongly observed map of custom, propriety and long habit. Mrs. Eleanor Price entered at 3 minutes to 11. That too was her custom. She moved to her pew on the right-hand side, placed at almost exact symmetry to Miss Marple's own, with the composed and measured dignity of a woman perfectly aware that her conduct was seen, and who considered such observation no more than it ought to be. Her coat was dark charcoal, well cut and entirely right. Her hat was of the restrained and excellent sort which announces quality without ever needing to insist upon it. As she passed, she gave Miss Marple a small inclination of the head, not warm but correct, and settled herself with the complete stillness of someone who had not merely sat down, but taken up a position. Mr. Julian Avery entered at 2 minutes to 11 and seated himself near the back. Miss Marple noted it without turning her head. She also observed that he had chosen a place from which he could see the congregation clearly without making himself especially visible in return. 2nd row from the rear, beside the pillar, where the light from the south window illuminated those farther forward rather than himself. Whether this had been deliberate or instinctive she could not say with certainty. She rather thought deliberate. The service moved forward in the accustomed way. Mr. Fenn preached on patience, a theme he thought suitable to the season, when the earth itself appeared to enter upon a period of waiting. He was earnest, and some of his illustrations laboured a little under the weight of their own preparation. But one observation struck Miss Marple as genuinely useful. Patience, he said, was not passivity, but sustained attention. Miss Marple stored the phrase away at once. It had relevance beyond the sermon. She did not look directly at Mrs. Price during the service. She looked at her afterwards, on the green. There, in the brightened air beyond the church doors, the post-service congregation had arranged itself in the usual manner. Small conversational groups forming and dissolving, redistributing themselves with the instinctive social geometry peculiar to villages and churchyards. It gave, from a distance, something of the effect of starlings changing formation. If starlings wore wool coats and discussed the weather, parish accounts, and the proposed heating appeal for the village hall, and Price had placed herself near the lich gate beside Mrs. Arthur Croft, the doctor's wife, who was a dependable presence in all social situations and seldom at a loss for a suitable topic. The 2 women appeared to be discussing something with animation. Yet Mrs. Price's attention was not entirely given to her companion. At intervals, with the unobtrusive skill born of a long social practice, it moved toward the path beside the church wall, where Mr. Avery had paused before the war memorial and was examining it with an air of mild, detached interest. Then, quite suddenly and quite inevitably, their eyes met. It occurred without design, or at least without visible design, as such things often do, when the accumulated awareness of one person toward another reaches a point where acknowledgement becomes mechanically unavoidable. The exchange lasted perhaps 2 seconds, perhaps 3. Mrs. Price's expression did not change in any way the average observer might have detected. Mr. Avery gave a small and courteous inclination of the head, which might have meant almost anything, and, Miss Marple thought, almost certainly meant something quite specific. Mrs. Price returned her attention to Mrs. Croft. Mr. Avery resumed his inspection of the memorial. Miss Marple, who had meanwhile been watching 2 sparrows dispute possession of a crumb on the path, and looked as if she were attending to nothing more consequential than that, stored the exchange away with her usual thoroughness. She spoke to Mr. Avery a few minutes later on the path in the most natural manner imaginable. as one might reasonably do after introductions had been made and an evening's conversation already shared. "A good sermon," she said. "Mr. Fenn improves." "He does," said Mr. Avery, falling into step beside her as they made their way toward the main road. His point about patience was well made, though I suspect it is easier to recommend than to practice. "Patience usually is," said Miss Marple. She glanced sideways at him with one of those brief, mild looks by which she habitually took the measure of a situation without seeming to disturb it. "You were watching Mrs. Price?" He did not deny it. "I was." "And she was watching you." She let a moment pass. "You resemble him, you know. Raymond. There were photographs once, or perhaps still are, in the village records. The resemblance is marked." For a moment he said nothing. They had reached the edge of the green now, where one path led toward the High Street, and the other toward Church Lane and Miss Marple's house. "That had occurred to me," he said at last. "It seemed possible that someone who remembered him might notice." "Mrs. Price noticed," said Miss Marple. "She remembers him very well. He was quiet. That," she added, "is visible to anyone who knows how to look." She drew her coat a little more closely about her against the October air. "The question, Mr. Avery, is what you mean to do with whatever you discover." He considered the matter before answering, and the seriousness with which he did so recommended him to her, more than a quicker reply would have done. "I have not come to distress anyone," he said at last. "I understand that whatever happened, the full truth of it belongs to a very old story, and that several people have arranged their lives around a particular version of it. I do not wish to break that arrangement merely for the pleasure of knowing." "Then what do you wish?" He looked out across the green, where the last of the congregation was dispersing with that slow, pause-filled deliberation peculiar to Sunday departures, when the week's social obligations are compressed into a series of brief and necessary exchanges. "Raymond died believing he had failed someone," he said. "He said he had spent the later years of his life with that conviction. He never knew whether it was deserved." He paused. "I would like to know, on his behalf, whether it was." He said it very quietly, and with no dramatic flourish at all. Perhaps because of that it carried more weight than a more emotional declaration might have done. Miss Marple heard in it not the excitement of inquiry, but the far steadier resolve of a man fulfilling something he regarded as an obligation. "And on your own behalf?" she asked gently. He turned to her then, and for a moment something in his carefully maintained composure gave way. Not entirely, but enough. "I was told, when I was old enough to understand such matters, that I had no family," he said. "That is the sort of knowledge a person carries for a very long time." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. The sparrows had flown off. The green lay pale and quiet in the Sunday light, silver at the edges and wholly unhurried. "When Margaret Price's name was mentioned this week," she said at length, "you will have noticed how often the subject altered." "I noticed." "That is not guilt," said Miss Marple. "At least I do not think so. It is something older and less conscious, the reflex of people who learned long ago that a certain name was not to be pursued, and who have retained the habit after forgetting the precise reason for it." She drew on her gloves with neat, practised fingers. "The habits of concealment, Mr. Avery, tend to outlive their original purpose far more faithfully than most human arrangements." He absorbed this carefully. "Then the concealment was deliberate at the beginning?" "At the beginning," said Miss Marple, "almost certainly." She wished him a pleasant Sunday and turned toward Church Lane. He remained for a moment where he was, watching her go with the expression of a man who had been given, in the course of a very ordinary conversation on a very ordinary Sunday morning, a good deal more to think about than he had expected, which, Miss Marple reflected as she unlatched her gate, was exactly what she had intended to give him. No more for the moment, and certainly no less. The garden received her in its autumn stillness. The pale sun continued its reserved work above the yew hedge, and St. Mary Mead settled itself with all due propriety into Sunday afternoon. Chapter 5. Winter lilies resting in a drawing-room vase. The borrowed book had remained upon Miss Marple's hall table, for rather longer than strict politeness could quite justify. It was a handsome volume, the sort of book which belonged unmistakably to an earlier generation of ladies. Pressed flowers mounted between thick cream pages, each specimen affixed with care and labelled in a precise, slightly old-fashioned hand. Mrs. Eleanor Price had lent it in August during one of those garden conversations that serve, among women of a certain age and habit, as a perfectly acceptable currency of friendship, warm enough to be sociable, restrained enough not to trespass upon intimacy. Miss Marple had read it with genuine pleasure. She had meant to return it promptly, as she generally did. She had not returned it promptly. If she examined the matter with perfect honesty, she could not say that this delay had been wholly accidental. She telephoned on Monday morning at 10 o'clock, a time when Mrs. Price was reliably at home and, more importantly, reliably alone. Her mornings were generally reserved for correspondence, household accounts, and the various private domestic duties which she dispatched before the village began laying claim to her afternoon hours. Mrs. Price answered on the third ring with the decisive efficiency of a woman who regarded the telephone as an instrument rather than an indulgence. "The pressed flower book," said Miss Marple. "I have kept it unconscionably long, Eleanor. I wonder whether I might bring it back this afternoon, about 3 perhaps, if that would suit you." It suited her. There was warmth in Mrs. Price's acceptance, measured certainly, but unmistakable, and it confirmed something Miss Marple had suspected since Sunday. Mrs. Price wished to speak. Indeed, she had likely wished to speak from the moment the name Avery had first entered her drawing-room, and had been held back only by those habits of composure and propriety which had served her all her life as both protection and restraint. The afternoon was dry, though almost entirely without colour, one of those late October days standing so near to November that it can no longer decide whether to be melancholy or merely austere, and settles instead for a kind of brisk, impersonal bleakness which at least possesses the merit of honesty. Miss Marple walked to Mrs. Price's house, which stood on the far side of the church from the Allotments, a neat Georgian terrace of moderate size, admirably kept and expressive of its owner's character in nearly every detail. The paintwork was immaculate. The step had been freshly whitened. The brass knocker shone with that slightly aggressive brightness, produced by polishing, undertaken more from principle than enjoyment. Mrs. Price admitted her herself. The Daily Woman had left at noon, and there was no one else about. She led Miss Marple into the drawing-room with her usual composed civility, which never quite relaxed into ease, but was always exact. The room was handsome in a quiet, orderly way. Good watercolours hung upon the walls. A dark writing desk stood at the window. On the mantelpiece a few chosen objects had been placed with the careful deliberation of a person who selected each thing for a reason rather than accumulating by habit. A clock, a pair of candlesticks, and a framed photograph of Margaret. Miss Marple had expected the photograph. What she had not expected was its position. It had not been there in June, or at least not there so prominently. It had been brought forward now, set more squarely toward the room, more plainly into view, and beside the settee upon the low table stood a plain white vase of very good taste, neatly holding a cluster of pale lilies. Lilies in October. Out of season, not inexpensive, and placed with a care that was plainly not decorative but commemorative. "How lovely," said Miss Marple, setting down the book and removing her gloves. "Lilies in October. One does not often see them." "Margaret was fond of them," said Mrs. Price. She spoke as though stating a simple domestic fact, yet Miss Marple heard in it the unmistakable sound of a door being opened. "I keep them," Mrs. Price added, "when I can find them." Tea was already prepared. The two women sat down, and for a few moments the ritual of cups, spoons, and pouring provided its own civilized shelter. The little clock upon the mantel chimed the half-hour with a discreet musical note. Beyond the windows the grey afternoon pressed quietly against the glass. Miss Marple allowed silence its due interval before she spoke. "The resemblance is striking," she said at last. "Between Mr. Avery and Raymond as a young man. I noticed it on the green. I imagine you noticed it rather sooner." Mrs. Price set down her cup carefully. She did not avert her gaze, which was characteristic. Eleanor Price met things directly, not from impulsive courage exactly, though courage she certainly possessed, but from a deeply rooted inability to retreat once a fact had presented itself. It was so ingrained in her that it had become indistinguishable from temperament. I noticed it the first morning he came into the village, she said. He passed the church on his way from the Blue Boar. I was arranging the collection boxes in the porch, she paused. For one very strange moment, I thought I was mistaken, that I was seeing something impossible. Then I understood quite clearly what I was seeing. Her hands folded in her lap with the neat discipline of long-contained feeling. I knew, she said, or thought I knew, that it would come eventually. These things do. Then she stopped and began again by another path, as people often do when approaching something they have spent years not saying aloud. Margaret was not a person one could forget entirely, she said. She was too... She hesitated. She was too much herself. Miss Marple received this without comment, though she marked it carefully. There was affection in the remark, and sorrow, and something more complicated than either. The tenderness of a person who has loved deeply, and also overridden, in some essential matter, the very person she loved. She was fragile, Mrs. Price continued. That is what I always said, and in some respects it was true. Margaret felt things more deeply than was comfortable, for herself, or for those about her. When she was happy, the whole house seemed altered by it. When she was unhappy, Mrs. Price pressed her lips together very briefly. It was difficult for all of us. And her friendship with Raymond Avery, said Miss Marple, keeping her tone in the register of ordinary inquiry. Mrs. Price was silent for a moment. On the mantelpiece, Margaret's photograph looked out into the room with that slightly uncertain smile peculiar to old portraits, the expression of a young woman doing her best to remain still before a camera while some vital inward quality resists the stillness. She had been, Miss Marple remembered, pretty, although not in the obvious or conventional way. There had been animation in the eyes, a quick inward liveliness that photographs never entirely captured, and life had carried much better. It was unsuitable, said Mrs. Price at last. In what respect? His employment was temporary. He had no settled prospects here. He was kind and attentive, certainly, but attentiveness in a young man of 24. She chose her words with care. It is not always accompanied by the steadiness a sensible woman ought to require in a husband, and Margaret, in the state she was in that summer, was not in a condition to judge clearly. Miss Marple considered the phrase in the state she was in with the quiet attentiveness she always gave to such formulations. There had been an illness, she said, earlier that year, if I remember correctly. A period of deep distress, said Mrs. Price. The words were stripped of detail with deliberate care, as though she wished to preserve the fact while removing all texture from it. She had been very low through the winter before Raymond came. By spring she was somewhat better. His arrival coincided with that improvement, and I think that made the attachment seem to her, and perhaps to him, more significant than it might otherwise have appeared. He was associated in her mind with recovery. In her mind, yes. A brief and rather painful expression passed over Mrs. Price's face, which is not necessarily the same thing as being its cause. It was a distinction very carefully drawn, and Miss Marple heard behind it the echo of many private arguments Mrs. Price had likely had with herself across the decades, revising and refining the moral case for what she had done until its edges sat comfortably enough to live beside. She cared for him very deeply, Miss Marple said. It was not a question. Mrs. Price looked toward the window. She was devoted to him, she said simply, and the simplicity of the words carried much more than any careful elaboration might have done. She told me once that he was the first person who had not handled her carefully, the first who had not treated her as though she were liable to break. Something moved beneath Mrs. Price's composure then, a genuine old grief, not fully arranged into acceptability. I understood that, she said. I did understand it, Jane. I should like you to know that. I know it, said Miss Marple gently. Mrs. Price's hands tightened once in her lap, and then relaxed. There was talk, she said, recovering something of her habitual steadiness. Neighbours, parish people, the kind of talk that fastens itself upon a young woman, seen too often in company with a young man who has made no formal declaration. It was harmful, not at once, perhaps, but it accumulated. As talk generally does, said Miss Marple. Yes, it accumulates. Mrs. Price reached toward her cup, seemed to recollect that she had set it aside and let her hand fall again. "I spoke to Raymond," she said, quite directly. "I told him Margaret's well-being depended upon certainty, that whatever his intentions, the ambiguity of the situation was doing her harm. What did he say? He said he cared for her deeply, that he intended to speak to his superiors about the possibility of securing a permanent post in the county, that he hoped—" She stopped very slightly. "He used the word 'hoped' rather often." "Hope," said Miss Marple, "is not usually much help when one is standing on uncertain ground." "No," said Mrs. Price, "it is not." For a little while she sat looking at the lilies in their white vase with an expression at once sorrowful, composed, and very tired. "He left that autumn on reassignment," she said at last. "His post required it. He was not dismissed. He simply went." She straightened, almost imperceptibly. And by then there was already a reason Margaret could not simply wait and hope with him. She said it without drama, in the level tone of a person reciting something which has long since been absorbed into the fabric of the past. Yet it entered the room with the full weight of something that had been compressed for years into too small a space. Miss Marple set down her own cup and folded her hands. "I see," she said, in a voice entirely gentle and entirely unsurprised. Through the window, the grey afternoon continued its indifferent progress. The lilies in their vase stood pale and motionless, faintly scenting the room with something that seemed not wholly of the present, and not wholly of memory either, but suspended between the two in the curious way certain truths are. Chapter 6. The Summer, the Orchard, Flooded. Memory, Miss Marple had long ago observed, does not preserve the past in the manner of a photograph, flat, exact, and faithful to the instant. It preserves it rather more like a garden, selectively tended, altered by weather, and shaped by what is deliberately encouraged and what is, by inattentional choice, quietly allowed to disappear. One remembers the broad arrangement of things, the colour of a dress, the quality of light in a particular summer, the sound of water standing where water ought not to stand, but sequence, proportion, and significance shift over time with such discretion that the revised version of events begins, after enough years, to feel perfectly original. Miss Marple was well aware of this tendency in herself as she was in others, and she treated her own recollections with the same measured caution she brought to any human testimony. Not disbelief exactly, simply the recognition that remembrance is always a reconstruction and must be handled accordingly. The summer of 1931 had, by general agreement, been a difficult one for the agricultural portions of the countryside about St. Mary Mead. The spring rains had been heavy and persistent and had failed, in June, to do what spring rains are generally expected to do, which is to cease. By July, the lower fields beyond the old mill lay under water in patches, and the orchard bordering the mill's eastern wall, a long-established planting of apple and pear trees belonging then to the Henderson family, stood flooded at the roots in a manner the older villagers declared they had not seen in 20 years. As it happened, the trees survived. Yet for the better part of 6 weeks the water remained pooled beneath them in a broad, shallow, entirely motionless sheet that turned the lower part of the village into something almost dreamlike. Ere on still mornings it caught the light with extraordinary beauty, so that the whole orchard seemed to stand doubled in reflection, softened and slightly estranged from itself. It was, Miss Marple thought afterward, one of those peculiar instances in which a practical misfortune produces a scene of almost unsettling loveliness, as though disaster had been given an artistic improvement. It was in that orchard, during those flooded weeks, that Margaret Price and Raymond Avery had most often been seen together. Miss Marple had assembled this recollection gradually over the days following Julian Avery's arrival, with the patient care of a person sorting a box of old correspondence whose contents had not been arranged in years. Memories returned as such things do, not in order, not on command, but unexpectedly, at the edge of some entirely different occupation. On Wednesday morning, while dead-heading the last of the roses, she had remembered quite suddenly, with that peculiar clarity certain memories retain after decades, the sight of Margaret Price in a pale blue dress standing at the orchard gate with one hand on the latch, looking back along the lane. She had been looking, Miss Marple now realised, to see whether she was observed. She had, in fact, been observed, only not by the person she expected. Miss Marple herself, returning from the village with her basket, had been several yards behind a hedgerow, which had provided a degree of accidental concealment. Margaret had not seen her. After that brief, searching glance behind, she had opened the gate and slipped through into the flooded orchard, where, some little distance among the standing trees, Raymond Avery had been waiting. Miss Marple had gone on her way. At the time she had told no one. It had seemed to her a private matter, and not one calling for intervention. She had stored it away, as one stores so many small incidents in village life, among the countless modest histories that accumulate without immediate relevance, and reveal their value only much later. It was relevant now. She mentioned the orchard to Mr. Julian Avery on Wednesday afternoon, when they met by tacit arrangement. Over the course of the previous week, they had established a comfortable habit of occasional conversation, which had the considerable practical merit of seeming entirely natural to anyone who might happen to notice it, a point of no small importance in a village of St. Mary Mead's size. They walked along the path that skirted the south side of the church and sloped gently toward the lower fields, where the old mill stood in its present condition of agreeable dilapidation, the wheel long since still, the walls dressed in mature ivy and the quiet authority of disuse. The day was cool and entirely windless. The path was narrow, uneven in places, edged with the brown remains of summer cow parsley, now reduced to delicate skeletal forms, which caught the pale sunlight and cast lace-like shadows over the ground. Mr. Avery walked with his hands in his coat pockets, and listened with the concentrated attention Miss Marple had come to recognise as his most dependable quality. "You asked," she said, once she had finished describing what she remembered of the orchard summer, "whether Raymond had ever acknowledged what you called an obligation left behind. That," she added, "was what you asked old Mrs. Hargreaves at the post office last Thursday." He glanced at her sidelong. "You were informed of that?" "Mrs. Baines mentioned it in passing," said Miss Marple with mild composure. She was not gossiping exactly. She was simply describing the morning's events as she generally does. He accepted this with the air of a man who had already learned that in St. Mary Mead there was little practical distinction between information and circulation. "And what does the phrase suggest to you?" he asked. "An obligation left behind?" "It suggests," said Miss Marple, "that you knew, or suspected, the essential nature of what had occurred between Raymond and Margaret before you ever arrived here. You were not trying to discover whether something had happened. You were trying to understand the extent of it." He was silent for a little while. They had come to the stile at the end of the path, and he held it for her with the same unassuming courtesy he showed in all small actions. Beyond it the land opened into lower meadow, still green despite the season, and at the far edge of it the dark walls of the mill rose against the pale sky, with that slightly melancholy solidity common to buildings which have outlasted the purpose for which they were made. "Raymond told me," he said, once they had crossed and continued along the broader track, "that he had loved someone in St. Mary Mead, and had never been given the opportunity to understand the full consequence of it." He paused. He was very old, and his language was sometimes indirect. But in those final months he was trying, I think, to say something true that he had never said properly before. He wished to acknowledge, to himself perhaps more than anyone, that he had left something unresolved, not because he deliberately abandoned it, because he was never allowed to know. The mill drew nearer as they walked. The orchard remained, though much changed. The Hendersons had sold the land years before, and the present owners kept it in a tidy, if somewhat uninspired condition. The old trees were regularly pruned. The grass beneath them was mown. Nothing in that clear autumn afternoon resembled the strange watery beauty of the flooded summer Miss Marple remembered. Yet they were the same trees, and their roots went down still into the same earth. "He was kept from the knowledge," she said. "That is a significant way of putting it. Did Raymond believe that concealment had been deliberate?" "He believed," said Mr. Avery carefully, "that he had not been trusted with the truth. Whether that amounted to deliberate concealment, or to something more complicated, something done by a person who believed she had reasons he could not fully understand. He could not say with certainty. He was not, in the end, a bitter man. He spoke with a precision that was curiously softened by tenderness. He told me he had tried, in his own mind, to be fair to Eleanor Price. He did not always succeed, but he tried. Miss Marple walked on in silence for several steps. The bare orchard trees stood in rows beyond the low fence, and the thin autumn light fell across them in that revealing rather than warming way peculiar to the season. The summer was the crucial period, she said at last. July and August. That was when they were most often together. By September, Raymond had received notice of reassignment, and Margaret had already begun to understand that her circumstances had altered. She spoke with the deliberate neutrality of one setting out facts rather than accusations. September was also when Eleanor learned of it. Margaret told her, I think, because she had no alternative and because, whatever Eleanor's limitations, she was the person Margaret trusted most in the world. That trust was not misplaced in the practical sense. Eleanor arranged everything with great efficiency. Raymond was told nothing. Nothing in Miss Marple's tone shifted. He left at the end of September for his new post, I believe somewhere in the North Midlands. By the time he had settled enough to write or return, the matter had already been contained. Margaret left in October. The village was told the story about her health, and Eleanor, having put everything in order with the best intentions and the greatest competence, shut the subject away. Mr. Avery stopped walking. They had reached the southern edge of the orchard wall, and he stood looking through the fence at the old trees, with an expression not easily separated into any one feeling. Not anger, not grief exactly, but something layered and long contained, like a room full of objects packed away with care and never opened for years. So, yes, he said after a moment. She chose not to tell him. Eleanor, she chose it. She did, said Miss Marple gently, with conviction, I think. With the certainty of a person persuaded she knows best and possessed of enough force of will to act before doubt is allowed to gather properly. She looked toward the spare, orderly trees in the autumn quiet. It is not a wicked impulse, she said. It is, in fact, a profoundly human one, the wish to manage a difficulty so thoroughly that the sharpest and most painful parts of it become invisible to everybody concerned, and eventually perhaps even to oneself. He said nothing for a while. Somewhere in the old eaves of the mill a wood-pigeon began its repetitive and contemplative address to the afternoon, then abandoned the effort. And Margaret, he asked at last. What did Margaret choose? It was the question Miss Marple had been waiting for, the important one. And it was the question she herself had been considering most carefully since her conversation with Eleanor Price 3 days before. That, she said, is rather more complicated, and rather more important. She turned from the orchard and looked at him with the steady clarity she reserved for moments when the thing being said required the whole attention of both speaker and listener. It is possible, she said, that Margaret's own choices have been obscured over the years by Eleanor's. It is possible that what has been remembered as Eleanor's management was not entirely Eleanor's to manage. He looked at her with sudden, sharpened attention. Come, said Miss Marple, turning back toward the path. I think the weather is changing. And I have always found that certain conclusions are best approached from the warmth of indoors. She walked on at her unhurried pace. Mr. Avery followed beside her. Behind them the bare orchard receded into the afternoon, and the old mill remained where it had always been, holding in its silence whatever it had once witnessed. Chapter 7. A Promise at the Railway Platform. The railway station at Compton Worthy, the nearest station to St. Mary Mead, situated some 2.5 miles along Compton Road, and served by a branch line of modest ambition, but generally reliable punctuality, had altered in no material particular since the 1930s. The waiting room still retained its original wooden benches and its iron fireplace, which in colder months the station master lit with a conscientiousness that put many private households to shame. The platform remained short, its painted edging faded into a soft and elderly suggestion of white, and the signal box at the far end was still manned by Mr. Harold Price, a man of few words and comprehensive local knowledge, who had now held the post for 23 years and who, in an earlier capacity as assistant to the previous station master, had been present for a good many October mornings before the war. Miss Marple had not visited the station for some months. She went there on that particular Thursday under the pretext of collecting a parcel from the parcels office, and although it was indeed a pretext, it was not an empty one. For the parcel existed and contained 4 skeins of wool in a particular shade of grey which she had been expecting since September. But the station had been on her mind ever since Tuesday, when the chain of recollections set in motion during her walk with Mr. Avery had arrived, with a kind of deliberate inevitability, at the morning of the 7th of October 1932. She collected her parcel first, which was only proper, tucked it under her arm, and then walked the length of the platform in the thin, cold morning air with the appearance of a woman, enjoying a modest and harmless excursion. The 7th of October, 1932, had been a Thursday. She was certain of the day because the ladies' parochial circle had met that Wednesday, and she could still remember, with the curious precision of memory attaching itself to the irrelevant, that the principal topic of discussion had been a spirited disagreement over the introduction of new hymn books. The following morning she had walked to the station to see off an elderly cousin who had been visiting from Bristol. The cousin, whose name had been Dorothy, and who had by now been dead these 20 years, had been a pleasant, if somewhat exhausting woman, with intensely fixed views on the correct handling of short-crust pastry. Miss Marple had escorted her to the station, in a mixture of genuine affection and discreet relief. Dorothy had insisted, as such people do, on arriving absurdly early, and they had therefore stood for some 15 minutes upon the platform before the Bristol train came in. During those 15 minutes Miss Marple had observed, at the far end of the platform near the goods entrance, a small scene which had impressed itself upon her with the peculiar clarity reserved for things accidentally witnessed at a distance, when one has no particular reason to watch, and therefore watches with complete innocence and considerable thoroughness. Eleanor Price had been standing very straight beside her younger sister. Margaret stood slightly apart with a brown leather travelling case at her feet. She wore a coat of deep green wool which Miss Marple remembered having seen before at the previous winter's carol service, and she had looked pale, not ill, precisely, but compressed, as though she had drawn herself inward, and was maintaining that inwardness by a sustained effort of will. Raymond Avery stood a little way from the two sisters, perhaps 6 or 8 feet away, close enough for speech, far enough to occupy that awkward position which is neither wholly included nor wholly excluded from a departure. He held his hat in his hand, and his face had the expression of a young man who has been told something he does not altogether accept, and is trying, not entirely successfully, to conduct himself with propriety in spite of it. The exchange between them had been brief. Miss Marple had not heard the words, could not possibly have heard them at that distance, particularly with Dorothy discoursing at length on the superior merits of cold butter, but she had observed gesture rather than speech. Raymond's hand moved once in a manner suggesting appeal and some sort of offering. Eleanor's chin lifted in that slight decisive way of hers which was not exactly refusal, but closure. Margaret remained still throughout, not looking at Raymond at all, but somewhere just beyond him, into the middle distance, with an expression of such resolved quietness that it was, in retrospect, more troubling than any open emotion would have been. At that point the Bristol train arrived and claimed Dorothy, and Miss Marple saw no more of how the departure concluded. She had thought of it occasionally over the years, not often, as there had been no reason to, but always with that faint and persistent discomfort one feels over a scene witnessed without context. At the time she had not known Margaret was with child. She had not known the full nature of whatever arrangement Eleanor had made. She had known only that something of consequence was taking place, and that it was none of her business, and that Dorothy's train was leaving. Now, as standing once more at the end of the Compton-Worthy platform and looking along its modest length, with the benefit of 37 additional years of human understanding, Miss Marple considered the scene afresh. What struck her most, revisiting it, was Margaret's stillness. It had not been, she thought, the stillness of absence or emotional vacancy. She had not read it that way then, and did not read it so now. It was rather the stillness of a person who has already made a decision and is in the process of carrying it through. That, Miss Marple reflected, was an entirely different condition from the stillness of someone for whom a decision has been made. The latter generally contains an element of suppressed resistance, a held and thwarted quality, like a spring compressed under weight. Margaret's stillness had not held that note. She had looked sad, certainly, but also resolved. It was a distinction of considerable importance. Miss Marple walked back along the platform, collected her wool, and returned to St. Mary Mead by the footpath that entered along the western edge of the village, passing the allotments and the church before delivering her to her own gate. The morning had brightened somewhat, not warmed, but brightened, with that silvery autumn light which falls upon hedge and wall and field with an impartiality that can almost be mistaken for generosity. She telephoned Mr. Julian Avery at the Blue Boar at 2 o'clock. He came to her sitting room at past, and Miss Marple set before him the conclusion she had been assembling with the careful patience of a person, laying out the pieces of an argument she means to make exact. Margaret made a decision, she said, once she'd described the scene at the railway platform and all she believed it implied. Or more precisely, Margaret had made a decision before ever she arrived there. What passed between Eleanor and Raymond in those last weeks was, I think, less the making of that choice than a negotiation about how to carry it out. Mr. Avery looked at her steadily. The fire was low and settled. The room had the quiet of a weekday afternoon in late October, when the village has finished its morning business and has not yet entered upon its evening round. "You are saying," he said slowly, "that Margaret chose not to tell Raymond." "I am saying," said Miss Marple, "that it is possible, indeed rather more than possible, that the concealment began with Margaret herself, and that Eleanor managed it afterwards with such thoroughness and over so many years that in both her own mind and the village's understanding she gradually became its author." She folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Eleanor is a woman of great executive ability, and of some tendency to take ownership of outcomes. It would be entirely in keeping with her nature to have taken a private grief belonging originally to her sister, and arranged it so completely that Margaret's own agency in the matter was slowly absorbed." He was very still. "Why?" he asked at last. "Would Margaret have chosen that?" "For any number of reasons entirely her own," said Miss Marple quietly. She may have believed that Raymond, faced suddenly with an obligation he had not knowingly incurred, would have felt bound to act, and that a marriage entered into under compulsion would have been worse than no marriage at all. She may have felt, after the difficulties of the previous winter, that she had not the strength for further upheaval. She may have wanted the child to begin life cleanly, without being tied from the first moment to a web of distress, uncertainty, and adult negotiation. She paused. Or she may simply have loved him, and found it more bearable to let him go completely than to keep him by means of an obligation he had never consciously chosen. The room remained very quiet. Outside, the light had turned that rich amber peculiar to mid-afternoon, falling through the window in a long slant across the hearthrug and warming it for a few brief minutes into a kind of temporary gold. "Raymond believed he had been kept from knowing," said Mr. Avery at last. "He believed it was Eleanor's doing." "Eleanor sustained that impression," said Miss Marple carefully, "for many years. Whether Margaret ever corrected it in letters, or in whatever private communication there may have been between them, I cannot say. But I think it entirely likely that Eleanor, in taking charge of the practical arrangements, also took charge of the story, and that Margaret, occupied with her own grief, and perhaps having made her peace with her decision in her own way, did not resist being absorbed into that version of events." He looked down at his hands for a little while before speaking again. "Then Raymond may have died believing he was wronged by Eleanor," he said, "when the truth was less simple, and perhaps more his own story to have claimed if he had been able." "The truth," said Miss Marple gently, very seldom belongs entirely to one person. That is what makes it so difficult to establish with complete certainty." He raised his eyes to hers. "But you do believe Margaret chose it?" Miss Marple met his look directly. "I believe Margaret was a woman of far more spirit than most people allowed," she said, deliberately repeating what she had told him before, though the words carried a fuller weight now, "and I believe that the person who knows most clearly what she chose and why is still living in this village, and has been keeping that knowledge for 37 years. She paused. "Not without cost." Mr. Avery was silent. "Eleanor," he said at last. "Eleanor," said Miss Marple, who places lilies in her drawing room because they were her sister's favourite flowers, and who has been watching you since your arrival with the expression of a person waiting for an examination she has long known must come, and has perhaps, in some quieter part of herself, not been entirely unwilling to face. The fire gave a small, companionable settling sound. The amber light lay for a moment longer on the rug, and then, as a cloud passed over, withdrew. "Then I must speak to her," he said. "I think," said Miss Marple, "that both of you should speak, and I think, if you will allow me the observation, that it may be wiser if such a conversation is not conducted entirely alone." She looked at him with the calm decisiveness of someone who has finished one stage of preparation and is already, in practical terms, entering the next. "Someone," she added, "who remembers the railway platform." For a moment something in his carefully maintained composure altered and became briefly younger, less defended. The expression of a man who has carried something alone for a long time and has just found, from an unexpected quarter, an offer of company. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, I should be grateful for that." Outside, the October afternoon continued its unhurried passage. On the hall table, the parcel of grey wool waited patiently for whatever came next. Chapter 8. Rain, tapping on the conservatory glass. The rain came on Friday morning with the calm inevitability of something promised for several days, and at last free to fulfil the obligation. It was not dramatic rain. There was no thunder, no violent gusting, no sudden theatricality of weather. It was simply a steady, patient application of water to surfaces which, after a dry week, had grown perhaps a little too self-satisfied in their dryness. The pavements of St. Mary Mead darkened at once to a deep, even grey, small purposeful streams formed in the gutters, and the rain settled over the village with the air of a long-expected guest who intends, quite civilly but firmly, to remain through the weekend. Miss Marple regarded it from the kitchen window with the philosophical composure of a person who had spent a lifetime making terms with English autumns. She had planned a walk. Indeed, she had planned several things which a determined rain now rendered either impractical or faintly absurd. So she revised her plans, as sensible people do when circumstances change, and took herself instead to her writing desk to attend to correspondence that had been waiting rather longer than she liked. She had completed 3 letters, and was considering a 4th when Mr. Julian Avery telephoned at 11 o'clock and asked whether she might be willing to walk with him despite the weather. It struck Miss Marple as an interesting request. There are people who require movement in order to think, who must first set the body in motion before the mind can properly approach anything difficult, and she had known many such people. A walk in the rain, moreover, has the practical advantage of discouraging interruption and reducing the chances of casual encounter. Very few villagers, unless obliged by necessity, choose to loiter conversationally in wet weather. She agreed, found her waterproof coat, her best umbrella, and the most dependable of her walking shoes, and met him at the gate at 11:30. They walked, as it turned out, not along any of the village's more frequented paths, but down the lane beside the churchyard and towards the lower road, where the hedges stood high enough to offer some shelter from the direct fall of rain, and the ground, though wet, was not yet treacherous. Mr. Avery carried his own umbrella, and had the air of a man who'd been thinking with some intensity since the previous afternoon, and had now reached the point at which speaking was no longer avoidable. Miss Marple did not hurry him. "I have been thinking," he said at last, when they had gone perhaps a quarter of a mile in companionable silence, "about what you said yesterday, about Margaret's agency in it, about the possibility that the choice was fundamentally hers, and that Eleanor has preserved the shape of it rather than its substance." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "It changes how I feel about Eleanor Price," he said. He spoke not emotionally, but with the exactness of a man reporting an inward fact. It does not excuse the concealment, nor the way Raymond was left to carry a belief that may not have been entirely accurate, but it complicates the picture. "The picture," said Miss Marple, "was always complicated. It has merely been arranged over the years, in such a way that some of its complications were hidden from view." He was silent for a little while. Rain made its soft collective whisper upon their umbrellas, upon the hedgerow leaves, upon the lane itself. It was, Miss Marple thought, rather a pleasant sound. Raymond learned of it indirectly, he said at last. In his last years. Someone mentioned Margaret Price in his hearing, not with any intention of telling him anything, simply in conversation about old county matters. But the name was accompanied by a detail, something about a child placed for adoption in 1932. Raymond's memory for the immediate past had become unreliable by then, but his memory for earlier life remained, in certain places, perfectly intact. He understood at once what it implied. Miss Marple listened in complete stillness. He tried to confirm it, Mr. Avery continued. Not very successfully, because he was by then a very old man, and his resources were limited. He wrote letters. I found several drafts among his papers, though I cannot say with certainty whether they were all sent. He wrote to what he believed was Eleanor Price's address, which may or may not have still been correct. He received no reply. He paused. He died without knowing whether his understanding was accurate, and he died, I think, with a conviction he had perhaps carried much longer than the late discovery itself, that he had failed someone, that he had left something unacknowledged because he had not known it existed, and that this ignorance, however it had come about, reflected some insufficiency in his own character. The lane curved, and the hedge on their left gave way to a low stone wall, beyond which the churchyard lay in its rain-darkened quiet, the older headstones leaning gently at their various accustomed angles, the newer ones straighter and paler in the distance. The yew at the southern corner stood dark and self-contained, high holding its collected rain with the resigned patience of trees long used to English weather. He was not a man who failed her, said Miss Marple after a moment. Whatever one concluded about the choices made that autumn, by Margaret, by Eleanor, by Raymond himself when he accepted Eleanor's account and went northward, he was not, Miss Marple knew, a man whose conduct had been shaped by indifference or neglect. He was a young man in an imperfect situation, she said, who was not given the information that would have allowed him to act otherwise. No, said Mr. Avery, he was not. There was in his tone something she recognised at once. Not relief exactly, but the settled quality of a conclusion reached after long private argument and kneading, before it can become real, to be spoken before a witness. Miss Marple had often thought that one of the most unremarked services conversation provides is precisely that. It supplies the necessary second mind before which certain recognitions can finally take form. "You are Margaret's son," she said. It was the first time she had spoken it plainly, without implication or caution. He did not answer at once. They had reached the churchyard gate, and he paused there, looking in at the wet grass, the pale stones, and the great dark steadiness of the yew. "I was told when I was 7 years old that I had been adopted as an infant," he said at last. "The people who raised me were good people, a schoolmaster and his wife in Gloucestershire. Kind, steady. I had a good childhood." He said this with the measured emphasis of a man for whom accuracy mattered deeply, and who wished to be fair. "I did not begin searching until I was in my 40s. It seemed, until then, a question that could wait." He looked at the yew a moment longer, and then it no longer could. "And you found Raymond first," said Miss Marple. "I found Raymond's name indirectly in the records associated with my adoption. He was not named openly, but there was a connection through county surveyor's office documents from that period, and a solicitor's reference which, when I followed it, led eventually to the Cheltenham address." He turned from the gate. "Raymond did not know who I was when I first approached him. I introduced myself simply as someone interested in local history from that period." Miss Marple gave the slightest inclination of the head, which was not, in the strict technical sense, untrue. "No," he said, while and a faint shadow of ruefulness touched his voice. "It was not. It was only as I got to know him that I began to understand he was following the same thread from the other end, the thread I had come looking for." "A thread he could no longer follow far enough himself," said Miss Marple. "No." He drew breath. Not quite a sigh, but near to one. "He died 3 months after I found him. We spoke a number of times. I think he suspected towards the end who I might be. He did not ask directly, and I did not tell him." He looked at her then with the directness she had come to recognise as his truest manner. "I have wondered since whether that was right. At the time it seemed a kindness. Now I am less certain." Miss Marple considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Kindness," she said at last. "Of that particular kind. The kind that withholds a truth in order to spare another person its complications, is a very old pattern in this story. I do not say your decision was wrong, only that you may understand it better once you have spoken with Eleanor," he nodded slowly. "She has the letters," he said. "I believe she has the letters Raymond sent in those final months. I believe she received them and did not reply, and that she has kept them." "I believe so too," said Miss Marple. It was not knowledge founded upon a single revelation, but on the accumulation of small consistencies. The photograph moved forward on the mantelpiece, the out-of-season lilies, Eleanor's controlled stillness on Sunday, the unmistakable composure of a person bracing herself, with some mixture of dread and resolution. For an accounting she is long expected and has never in her deepest self entirely wished to avoid. "Then there is still something she is holding," he said. "There is," said Miss Marple, "but I do not think she is holding it against you." She turned her face slightly towards him, and in her voice there was warmth now, because he was, she believed, genuinely trying to do a difficult thing well. "I think she's holding it because she has not, until now, known how to set it down." The rain eased a little, not stopping but thinning into the more tentative fall of a shower, rethinking its intentions. Beyond the gate the churchyard remained patient and still. "Tomorrow," he said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Tomorrow would do very well." They turned then and walked back along the lane together in the quiet companionship of two people who have reached, without making a great matter of it, the very edge of the thing toward which they have been steadily walking, and have agreed to cross it. The rain came home with them. Chapter 9. The evening Miss Marple was being followed. The rain had cleared by Saturday morning, leaving behind it that particular clarity which follows a sustained autumn fall, a sharpness in the outlines of things, a freshness in the air that was not warmth exactly, but carried in it something more generous than mere cold. St. Mary Mead had the washed, settled look of a place freshly attended to. The pavements were darkened to a deep, clean grey. The hedges still gleamed from yesterday's weather. And by mid-morning a pale but perfectly genuine sun had established itself above the church tower, and was doing what it could. Miss Marple had arranged for Mrs. Price and Mr. Avery to come to her sitting-room at 3 o'clock. She had telephoned Eleanor that morning after a night of considered sleep, using a formula she had employed once before in a rather different but not wholly unrelated situation some 30 years earlier, involving a matter of misdirected trust between two village families which had ultimately been brought to a satisfactory conclusion in this very drawing-room over good tea and an excellent plate of shortbread. The formula was simple. She said that there was something of importance she wished to discuss, that it concerned a mutual acquaintance, and that she believed a conversation between 3 people rather than 2 would be of benefit to all concerned. She had been entirely direct about the identity of the third person. Eleanor had been silent for a moment. It was a very exact silence, long enough to demonstrate that the invitation had been fully understood, not long enough to suggest that acceptance required any real deliberation. 3 o'clock, she had said. "Yes, I shall be there." That was all. No questions, no conditions, no attempt to narrow the subject in advance. Miss Marple had put down the telephone with the familiar sense, well known to her from long acquaintance with Eleanor Price, that she was dealing with a woman who, once she had made a decision, implemented it with a thoroughness that left very little room for reconsideration. Whether that decision had in fact been made some time ago, and only awaited the proper occasion for enactment, Miss Marple could not say with certainty. She rather thought it had. She prepared the sitting-room with the same careful attention she always gave to occasions of real significance. The fire was built up to a steady, reliable warmth, not excessive, but sufficient. The tea things were arranged upon the low table with the good china she reserved for visitors, and there was seed cake on a plate, the same kind that had served Mr. Avery so well on his first visit, which seemed to Miss Marple a small continuity worth maintaining. She moved the upright chair from beside the bookcase, and brought in instead the second armchair from the spare room, comfortable without being possessive of comfort. The room now held 3 chairs of roughly equal appeal arranged about the fire, which seemed to her the proper physical expression of what she intended the conversation to be: balanced, unhurried, and free of obvious hierarchy. Mr. Julian Avery arrived at 5 minutes to 3 as she had expected. He was dressed with his customary care, and he was, Miss Marple observed, somewhat paler than usual, which she had also expected. He accepted the chair she indicated and sat with the controlled stillness of a man whose composure was real, but currently required to do a good deal of work. "She will come," said Miss Marple. It was not reassurance so much as statement. "I know," he said. And he did know. That, Miss Marple thought, was perhaps the most useful consequence of the week's accumulated conversations. He had arrived in Saint, on a Mary Mead knowing almost nothing about Eleanor Price. He was now in a position to understand her sufficiently to predict, with some accuracy, how she would conduct herself when she entered this room. Understanding did not produce approval, nor did it remove difficulty, but it altered the nature of what one was approaching. Eleanor arrived at precisely 3 o'clock. She came in wearing the charcoal coat she'd worn on Sunday, exchanged it in the hall for her indoor things, and took the remaining chair, which happened to be nearest the window, where the afternoon light fell across it, in a way that was neither flattering nor severe, merely clear. She carried herself, as always, with the upright composure of long practice, and when she looked at Julian Avery, she did so with the same directness Miss Marple had observed in every encounter between them since his arrival. "Mr. Avery," she said. "Mrs. Price," he said. Miss Marple poured the tea. The silence that followed the pouring was of the useful sort, the kind that allows 3 people to settle themselves in one another's presence before the room is asked to hold anything difficult. Miss Marple had long ago learned that this period of settling, however uncomfortable it might feel to those eager to proceed, was very rarely wasted. It was Eleanor who spoke first, which was also what Miss Marple had expected. "You know who he is?" she said to Miss Marple. It was not a question. "Yes," said Miss Marple. Eleanor turned then to Julian Avery and looked at him with the complete sustained frankness she had been withholding since Sunday, and directing at him now the full gaze of a woman who had decided that the time for looking away was over. "You are very like him," she said. "As a young man, I mean. Not as he was when I last saw him, which was some years later and at a distance, but as he was in 1931. She paused. "I noticed it the first morning." "I thought you had," he said quietly. "I received his letters," she said. The sentence came without preamble, as though it had been waiting in an anteroom for some time and had simply at last been admitted. 3 of them, she continued, during the winter and spring. His handwriting was not what it had once been, but his meaning was plain enough. "You did not answer," said Mr. Avery. Eleanor set down her cup with that exactness of movement which seemed inseparable from her. "I did not know how to answer," she said. There was in the sentence something that was not quite apology and not quite explanation, but occupied some more honest territory between the two. "That is not," she added, "an adequate reason. It is simply the true one." The fire shifted softly. The light from the window held its patient angle across the arm of her chair. "I persuaded Margaret," Eleanor said then, addressing not one of them but the room itself, in the manner of someone delivering testimony long prepared in silence, that telling Raymond would serve no useful purpose. That was what I believed. I believed it entirely. She looked down at her hands for a moment. The first time, Miss Marple thought, that Eleanor Price had looked away from anything in the course of this conversation. He had his reassignment. His prospects were elsewhere. Margaret was... She stopped, then continued. Margaret was not unwell in the way she had been the previous winter, but she was fragile, and the thought of a confrontation, of uncertainty, of not knowing whether he would stay from love or from duty, she said she could not bear it. "She told you that," said Miss Marple gently. Eleanor looked up. Something altered in her expression. It was very slight, but clear enough to anyone paying close attention. "She told me," she said. "Yes." It was her decision first. She did not say it with relief. The note in her voice was something more like exhaustion. The exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a burden for so long that the act of setting it down does not at first bring lightness, but only the bewildering realization of how heavy it has been. "I arranged everything," she said. "I managed it all. I was better at managing than she was, and she was grateful, and in the managing over the years." She drew a breath. "I suppose the decision became mine in memory, in the way I spoke of it, even to myself." "But not in the beginning," said Miss Marple. "No," said Eleanor quietly, "not in the beginning." The room received this admission in complete stillness, as rooms do when something long locked away has finally been opened and no one present wishes to disturb the air about it too quickly. Mr. Avery had remained very still throughout. Now he leaned forward slightly, his hands together, his eyes on Eleanor Price with an expression that was not accusation and not forgiveness. Both would have been premature, and he was not a man who moved prematurely. It was something nearer, and Miss Marple thought, to recognition. "She gave the child up willingly," he said. It was not quite a question. Eleanor met his gaze. "She grieved," she said, "for many years, and in her own way. But she had decided, she believed, and I think she was not wrong, that a child beginning life without the weight of adult obligation, placed with a family who wanted him entirely and for himself, would have a better beginning than one born into the complications of that situation." She paused. She was not abandoning him. She was choosing for him as clearly as she could from where she stood. Something passed across his face then, briefly, but not too quickly for Miss Marple to see it. It was not relief, nor grief precisely. It was something quieter and more fundamental, the expression of a man hearing for the first time, the reasoning behind the decision that had shaped his entire life, and finding in it, if not comfort, then at least the absence of cruelty. "She did not know about me specifically," he said. "No," said Eleanor. "The adoption was arranged through an intermediary. She asked only that the child be placed with a good family in a quiet county, and that she not be told the details." "Gloucestershire," he said. Eleanor's composure held, though something moved beneath it. "I did not know that," she said. "I am glad of it." The afternoon light had shifted a little, as it always does, even in short conversations, the sun pursuing its quiet course beyond the window. Miss Marple refilled the cups. The seed cake sat between them, slightly diminished. "I followed you along the allotments that first evening," said Mr. Avery after a moment, just turning to Miss Marple with the nearest approach to lightness she had yet heard in his voice, "because I had already decided you were the person most likely to know everything, and the least likely to be personally invested in defending any particular version of it." "I was flattered," said Miss Marple composedly, "by both halves of that conclusion." Eleanor Price looked across the fire at Julian Avery with the expression of a woman who had laid down something she had carried for 37 years and was still learning what her hands felt like without it. "She would have been glad of you," she said quietly, "of the person you appear to be." She said it without ornament, which was the only way Eleanor said anything that mattered deeply. "I think she knew," Eleanor added, "yet in the way one sometimes does know such things without any evidence, that matters had gone well." He received this without speaking. He did not need to speak. The sitting room held the three of them in its firelit quiet, and outside the October afternoon went about its unhurried business, while the matter that had travelled from a flooded orchard in 1931 to this lamplit room in 1969 rested for the moment in the stillness of something at last fully seen. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. There was, she thought, still one more thing to be done, but it would keep very well until tomorrow. Chapter 10. A Seat Beneath the Yew Tree. The churchyard of St. Cuthbert's contained, among its various stones and memorials, a plain oak bench positioned beneath the yew tree at the southern corner. It had been placed there some 15 years earlier by the parish council in memory of a former churchwarden, and had since been maintained with the unostentatious thoroughness St. Mary Mead generally applied to its civic furniture. It was a bench that caught in the morning a measure of sheltered sun, and in the afternoon looked out upon the older portion of the churchyard, where the uneven headstones stood in their various stages of weathering, and the grass between them was kept short by some combination of the sexton's diligence and a small colony of rooks who regarded the ground as a private and extremely satisfactory amenity. Miss Marple had sat on this bench at intervals throughout her life in the village, and she sat there again now on a Sunday morning in the first days of November, or some 2 weeks after the conversation in her sitting room. The air was cool and very still, carrying that early November quality quite distinct from October's tentativeness. Something more settled, more committed to its own temperature. Her coat was buttoned. Her gloves were on. She was not knitting, which in itself was sufficiently unusual to suggest she had come with a definite purpose rather than from simple habit. The morning service had ended half an hour earlier. The congregation had dispersed in the usual Sunday manner, and the churchyard had resumed its weekday character, self-contained, unhurried, and entirely indifferent to the clock. Miss Marple heard the gate and was not surprised. Dolly Bantry came along the path with the direct, energetic movement she brought to most of her progress through the physical world, and sat down beside her with the ease of long friendship. She wore a dark red coat and carried her gloves rather than wearing them, having evidently been too warm inside the church to put them on again, and not yet cold enough to regret it. "You were not at the service," said Miss Marple. "I was," said Dolly, "at the back. Mr. Fenn knocked over the hymn-board this time, which I think may be counted as innovation." She paused. "I also noticed Eleanor Price and Mr. Avery sitting in the same pew." "Yes?" said Miss Marple. Dolly was quiet for a moment, looking up at the U with the expression of a woman constructing her inquiry carefully. "You're not going to tell me all of it," she said at last. "I have known you long enough to recognise when you have decided something is not yours to tell." "The essential parts of it belong to people who are still living," said Miss Marple. "That imposes certain obligations." "It does," said Dolly without resentment. This was one of the qualities Miss Marple valued most in her old friend, the capacity to accept a limit without demanding that it be disguised as something more agreeable. "But you will tell me what you think of it." Miss Marple considered the yew tree for a moment. It was a very old tree, older than the bench, older than many of the stones surrounding it, older by centuries than much of the present church itself. It had that dark, contained authority which belongs to things that have grown slowly and not been hurried into shape. "I think," she said at last, "that a long time ago several people did what they believed to be right, and that what each of them believed to be right was not entirely wrong, and not entirely enough, and that the combined effect of it caused a great deal of unnecessary sorrow." She adjusted one glove with the other, "which," she added, "is, in my experience, the commonest form of human unhappiness, not wickedness, not stupidity, merely the accumulated consequence of people doing their best in circumstances that did not reward their best with any great fairness. And now there is at least clarity, which does not undo what has been, but does prevent the further compounding of it." Dolly thought about this. A rook landed upon a nearby headstone with the proprietorial air of a person returning to a familiar seat, considered them briefly, and decided they were of no immediate interest. "The young man," said Dolly carefully, "he seems, well, I have seen him about the village these last 2 weeks. He seems easier somehow." "He does," said Miss Marple. In the fortnight since the conversation in her sitting room, Julian Avery had remained in St. Mary Mead. He had not formally announced an intention to do so. He had simply stayed, in the quiet and untheatrical manner that characterised his behaviour generally, extending his arrangement at the Blue Boar from 1 week to the next. He had called on Eleanor Price the Thursday after their meeting. Miss Marple knew this because Eleanor had mentioned it briefly, and in the matter-of-fact tone she reserved for things that had been decided and required no further performance. He had gone again the following Tuesday. What precisely passed between them during those visits Miss Marple did not know, but she observed, as she observed most things in St. Mary Mead, the outward evidence of effect. Eleanor, when seen now about the village, still carried herself with the same habitual uprightness, but she no longer bore the specific tension of someone braced inwardly against an expected reckoning. She looked, in the plainest sense, less burdened. He had also visited the churchyard. Miss Marple had seen him early one morning from her garden wall, standing quite still beside a headstone in the older portion. Margaret's, she had presumed, from the location and from the quality of his stillness. He had not brought flowers. He had simply stood there, not performing remembrance but acknowledging it. He remained perhaps 10 minutes, and then walked back through the gate and down the lane with that same measured, thoughtful step that seemed his natural pace. On the following Saturday, Eleanor had come as well. She brought lilies, pale, out of season, wrapped simply, and laid them down without ceremony. Julian Avery had not been with her then. Some acts of recognition, Miss Marple thought, require solitude. Others require company. Wisdom consists in part in knowing which is which. Eleanor, whatever her failings, had always been exact in practical matters. She had judged this one correctly too. "She feels responsible," said Dolly, who had been thinking through Miss Marple's silence. "She is responsible," said Miss Marple, "in part. But responsibility and culpability are not the same thing, and she has confused them for 37 years, which is a very long time to sustain any confusion without cost. And Margaret," said Dolly, "was she happy?" It was the question Miss Marple had expected. She answered it with the care it required. "I think she was a woman who made peace with her own decisions," she said, "and did not require that peace to be applauded. She lived quietly after leaving the village. From what Eleanor has told me, she made herself useful. She worked for a time with a charitable organisation assisting displaced families. In other words, she redirected a considerable capacity for feeling into forms the world could receive and make use of." She looked again at the yew. "That is not unhappiness exactly. It is a particular kind of life. It suits certain kinds of people, and Margaret was one of them." Dolly sat quietly. The morning sun, such as it was, moved a little higher beyond the yew and found the bench, laying a narrow band of warmth across their shoulders with the modest generosity peculiar to November light. "And what will he do?" Dolly asked. "Mr. Avery, will he stay, do you think?" "I do not know," said Miss Marple. "He has his own life in Cheltenham, and whatever shape it takes must still be lived. He came here looking for something, and he found it, though not in precisely the form he expected, which is very often the case with important searches." She paused. "But I think he will come back. There is something here that belongs to him now, whether he could have said so 3 weeks ago or not." Dolly nodded slowly. Then, because she was Dolly Bantry and could not remain solemn for too long without some compensating descent into the practical, she said, "You were followed, Jane, along the allotments in the dusk by a gentleman of uncertain purpose, and your response was to invite him to tea." "My response," said Miss Marple composedly, "was to assess the situation correctly and act accordingly. He was not of uncertain purpose. He was of very specific purpose, which is quite a different thing, and I had determined that before I turned around. And if you had been wrong," Miss Marple considered this with the sincerity she always gave to hypothetical error, "then," she said, "the tea would still have been perfectly good." Dolly laughed, the generous, unembarrassed laugh that had startled and delighted St. Mary Mead for years, and Miss Marple allowed herself a small, warm smile. They sat a little longer on the bench beneath the yew. The rook returned, reconsidered, and departed once more for a more interesting headstone. The morning moved quietly about them, as mornings do in villages, where nothing dramatic appears to happen, and yet important things are always occurring, in sitting rooms, in churchyards, and along the lanes between them, among people who are doing their imperfect and often honest best to understand one another. Miss Marple drew her coat a little closer, and looked up at the November sky with that composed attentiveness she brought to all things. There was, she reflected, always a great deal still to be understood in the world. There always would be. But on this particular morning, in this particular churchyard, the portion of the world that had lately presented itself to her attention had at least been met, steadily, without dramatics, and with considerably better tea than such occasions strictly required. That, on the whole, was enough. Autumn deepened over St. Mary Mead. The bench beneath the yew held its place in the thin November light, and the village went on about its quiet business as it had done before and would continue to do again, carrying its accumulated histories with the patient, unremarkable faithfulness of places that have learned, over time, to live beside time itself.